A lot of the first thing that people think about is sponsorships and ads and stuff. But the math behind that is not even close to what you can make in affiliate marketing. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of people may not be aware of. And those are the things that I like to utilize in kind of generating revenue for myself.
Are you not getting the downloads you desire? Unsure about how to promote your podcast effectively? Or struggling to monetize your work? Well, you've just found the resource you need. Hi and welcome to Mics to Millions, the podcast that brings you exclusive, in-depth conversations with top-tier hosts in the health and wellness industry to help you grow your podcast. I'm your host, Sam Breakgear, co-founder of Podwritten, a podcast booking agency for health and wellness businesses. In every episode, we dive deep into what it really takes to get more podcast listeners, successfully promote your show, and monetize your work. Remember, if you like the show, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. This helps us grow, and in doing so, we can continue to offer you valuable insights and podcast growth tips. Now, let's get into it. My guest today is the host of the Health Coach Academy, a show that shares cutting-edge strategies for certified health coaches, and a co-host of This Podcast Burns Fat, a podcast that functions as a dedicated resource to help listeners create lasting weight loss while optimizing their health. Combined, these shows attract roughly 7,000 monthly listeners. Additionally, he's a professional health coach and has received training from the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, where he was trained in more than 100 dietary theories and studied a variety of practical lifestyle coaching methods. He offers a unique approach to those looking to achieve a healthy lifestyle and helps his clients unlock the key to making their most balanced life, physically, spiritually, and nutritionally. Omar Cumberbatch, welcome to the show.
Hey, Sam, thanks for having me. Appreciate you inviting me on. We're really excited about today's episode.
I am really happy to have you here because not only do you host one podcast, but two. So I'm going to be really interested in finding out what it's like running two podcasts. But before that, can you take us back to the beginning and what was the impetus, what was the light bulb moment that sparked the creation of Health Coach Academy specifically, and then maybe move on to This Podcast Burns Fat?
Yeah, no, definitely. Again, I appreciate being on the show. And one of the things that I always like to talk about, because Health Coach Academy and this podcast, Burns Fat, seems like that was the start of the two podcasts, but it actually took a little bit longer to get those off the ground. I actually had a show called The Wellness Ultimatum for about 2 years. And then I rebranded and turned that into a show that was called oh man, I forgot it was called because it was one of those shows that didn't really, it's called Optimal Condition, right? Or something along that lines. And so I kind of rebranded. And at that point, I was getting a lot of listeners, right? And it just wasn't really getting me anywhere where I needed to go as far as monetizing the podcast, really getting dedicated listeners, even though I had a substantial amount of downloads. I just couldn't get it to stick. And then what I did, I started to look for some help, and I kind of got into podcasts for this particular person who I enjoyed this podcast tremendously. His name was Sean Croxton. And I really was excited about doing exactly what he was doing, right? He was basically having just awesome guests on his show, talking about health and wellness. And that was really what I wanted to do. I wanted to just sit down and read books and invite authors on the show and talk about the books that I just read. I thought it was a kind of a dream job. So I actually received some mentorship from him. And basically, he kind of outlined why I was having such a struggle with my previous editions of the podcast, and really ended up streamlining exactly what I needed to do to get some traction in these kinds of venues, right? So one of the things that I started Health Coach Academy for was basically that struggle itself. I was a health coach and I wasn't getting any traction in business, and I wanted to interview business minds who helped wellness entrepreneurs actually get off the ground and really show, tips in marketing, branding, and such. And so it was kind of like a selfish project that just cooked and became very successful. And as far as This Podcast Burns Fat, one of the people who I interviewed was Dr. Lori Shemek, and we had an off-the-air conversation about her desire to start a podcast, and we had such a connection. We just said, hey, listen, why don't we do one together? And that's kind of the genesis of that particular show. So that's how I had started and have continued for the last 5 years of having 2 podcasts simultaneously. And it's one of the things that I really enjoy on a day-to-day basis. It's such a great experience, especially if you love this type of format.
That's fantastic. So you two literally met on a podcast and decided, let's do a podcast together.
Yeah. Yeah, and that there's a backstory to that too, actually, because I recorded an episode with her, and Lori's kind of a big deal. She's, I guess they would call her a micro influencer. I think it's something over, I forget the statistics as far as how they define that, but she's definitely has a huge following, and it's in the hundreds of thousands. And the initial episode, believe it or not, I recorded it, and when I hit the button to end and we get off, I listened to it, and it was only me talking. So, and I was mortified because, again, of her status, and I just completely botched it. And I basically had to go with my, tail between my legs and ask her whether or not we could re-record it. And she graciously said yes. And then in that conversation, we had that conversation to say, hey, would you be interested in doing this? And, we're nearly 200 episodes in later, and we're still on and kicking. So it was a traumatic experience at the time, but turned out to be a wonderful journey just to talk about, of course, 5 years down the road.
That's fantastic. And it's wonderful that something that someone might look at and say, oh, that's an unfortunate event. Maybe the episode didn't turn out so well. You revisited it, and then a whole podcast bloomed from that. So that's fantastic.
Yes, no, definitely.
So I do know that you started Health Coach Academy in 2017, right? And this podcast Burns Fat following year in 2018. What did that first year look like? Let's say for Health Coach Academy, like, what steps did you take? Obviously, you had some experience having produced your previous podcast, The Wellness Ultimatum and Optimal Condition. What did that first year look like?
Yeah, so the first year for that was so much different and much more successful than the first time. Like I said, I kind of had some guidance, of course, through Sean, and just had my own personal hiccups. I was just able to really focus on and target specific guests that I really wanted to be on the show. And my show's format is with guests, and I prefer it that way. I kind of have the understanding that I'm not someone who can just talk for, 30, 40 minutes on my own and just ramble on about certain topics. I like the conversation. So in that iteration, as far as when I started Health Coach Academy, we had the resources at that point to have guests on and kind of carry the show and ask good questions and really just drive our mission home. But I guess in that context, that year was pretty easy in the sense that we had an abundance of guests, we had an abundance of topics that we wanted to touch upon. And it wasn't that way in the beginning. Back in my other iterations of trying to get on and do podcasting naturally, it wasn't doing what I anticipated it doing. And I kind of learned from those experiences that there is a formula for that. I mean, there's something that I was going week to week kind of desperate for guests. And I think that was just kind of not being prepared to have a real launch strategy around those things. So my first year was vastly different than when this podcast Burns Fat came out and Health Coach Academy podcast came out as well.
Okay, that makes sense. And you obviously mentioned the importance of the role that Sean played in all of this. Would you recommend to anyone thinking of starting a podcast to hire a specialist like this?
Absolutely. One of the interesting things about just the information age, and just we do have unlimited information. And I was the type of person who kind of thought that, I can watch enough YouTube videos and kind of watch anything or say read anything to try to piece things together, but they are in pieces, right? So to have someone who's been through that journey before you, who can put it together in a package, or just even in a step-by-step linear way of getting from point A to point B, and kind of guide you through some of the hiccups that you're going to go along the way, it's invaluable. So for instance, I mentioned, I did languish for a couple of years, and I don't think that anybody who's trying to get into podcasting or any venture needs to do that, especially when they can get assistance. I know a lot of people have that tendency to think that they could just do it on their own and eventually it'll pan out. But I definitely think if I had to do it again, I would pay the upfront cost of having someone to mentor me through some of this stuff as opposed to just kind of languishing, because that's one thing. And again, I guess it was benefit for my personality type. I wasn't someone who was going to quit on anything, but I can definitely see so many people, especially, health coaches right now. And that's kind of a theme of Health Coach Academy. It's like, we have this passion, we want to do these different things, but it's very easy to get deterred. And if you don't have that, like, it's going to get done somehow kind of mentality, you probably will quit and may not have the podcast that's going to have so many extraordinary benefits once you get off the ground with it.
Yeah, and I have to say, having worked in the podcasting space that's specifically focusing on health and wellness, there's a lot of people out there and there's a lot of people doing this. So I can imagine it is easy to get deterred if you're not getting the results you hope for. Obviously, you mentioned previously you had podcasts in the past and they weren't bringing you the results that you wanted for your business. Now you've gone through this process and you're seeing the results that you want. How has having these podcasts help you tackle these issues and benefit your business?
Yeah, no, there's a number of ways. So I know that some people will do make a living exclusively off podcasting, right? So like you could think of the bigger shows like Joe Rogan show and let's say Dave Asprey shows where they just have such a huge audience and impact. I saw, that's of course where I would love to to be one day. I do,
Yeah.
who wouldn't really want that to happen? But I found, interestingly enough, that there's so many undefined benefits of having the podcast. Like, one of the things that I do know and have recognized as far as business goes is that you do stand out as an authority, especially when you link yourself up with other authorities in the business. So when you have a guest on your show who's really well known and popular, it's almost like going to high school again, right? Where it's like, how is that kid hanging out with the cool kids? He must be cool too, right? It's kind of this impression that goes up into the way that people perceive you. So they kind of give you an authorship just by association. So that's been beneficial because people do want to work with you into that capacity. And then they also, other guests who see, okay, if this person's on the show, it must be good enough so I can be on that show too, especially when they're bigger names. I also think that when it comes to, say, monetizing podcasts and monetizing these opportunities, there's nothing that gets in the way as far as having the ability to network. That's one of the things, like a lot of these people who you do eventually get into like conversations with on and off air, you are able to develop like networking opportunities, and a lot of these networking opportunities lead to affiliate partnerships and such, which will, and if you want me to get into the affiliate, I could get into that a little bit too, because I think that's one of the key things that I think a lot of people who may be on the fence about starting a podcast might actually go into podcasting just because of the nature of how that works.
Yeah, I'd be interested. Do you use that for your business?
I do, yes. And then one of the things that I feel, so it's like the affiliate thing, just so people will get an idea. It's like, as you know, there's tons of courses, in promotional things that people sell. As an affiliate, you get like special coding. So for instance, if you had a podcast course, you would get a podcast like code, like it's a coupon of sorts that say, if you sign up, you'll get 10% off. And then the person who's actually giving you the affiliate might give you a kickback of, 10 or 20%, depending on how generous some of these things are. So as you can imagine, if you multiply that across like your audience, say, even if you have a small audience, say you have maybe 100 people in your audience, but at the end of the day, 20 of them buy a high ticket course from your affiliate, you're going to get a kickback just with that. And a lot of people do make a lot of money off of that. Sean did as well. He made God knows how much money. Like he was telling me, just having just a mailing list of, say, 160,000 at the time. And if he was selling high ticket items, like he had a lot of huge guests on at the time who, if they had like a $5,000 course, they would give them $1,000 per sale, which is 20%. And you just multiply that by like the percentage, 1% of that, it was 1,600 people signed up for a course times 1,000. It was like he literally, these guys are doing that out there right now. So that's definitely something that I think other people should take into consideration, especially when they're looking for other avenues of how to make money. Like a lot of the first thing that people think about is sponsorships and ads and stuff. But the math behind that is not even close to what you can make in affiliate marketing. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of people may not be aware of. And those are the things that I like to utilize in kind of generating revenue for myself. I also think that especially when you're trying to launch courses and stuff like that, and for instance, I have a podcast course, it just gives me the opportunity to share it with an audience of whoever's listening. And it's out there, and it's like free promotion every time that I actually have an episode. And that's very beneficial as well. And any product that you have, it's your show that you can actually just display and put and present it in front of larger audience. So it's a good platform to do so.
Those are some great benefits. And I love so much what you spoke about. Also, I love what you mentioned before about networking. I have to say that's one of my reasons for really starting this podcast, is because I obviously work with a lot of podcast hosts, and a lot of time is just back and forth emails, and those are fine. I love communicating with the hosts like this, but I also love this opportunity to actually get to speak with you. Obviously, Omar, you and I have spoken before via email, but this just feels so much more personal. It just feels nicer to be able to put a voice to a name and actually have a real conversation, an uninterrupted conversation for like an hour or so. Is just so rare these days.
Right.
So I really appreciate doing that and getting to know people better. So definitely the networking opportunities are fantastic. And you also mentioned about this like cool by association, which I really liked. And that's actually something that I tried to do with the pitches I send, in the sense that I'll always try and add like a PS. You can check them out on this podcast. And I think it's really good once you have that association. If you get booked onto a podcast and it's a big podcast, then naturally like the size of that podcast benefits you, and you get to stick your name on that. And kind of like on that note, I know that you've done guesting on a number of podcasts. Like, what would you say the benefits from your perspective of being a guest that you don't always get when you're a host?
Oh, well, yeah, no, it's your introduction to a completely new audience, right? So it's so cool because your audience as a host is, it's not that it's static, but it's kind of in the same topics and same genres of people looking for the same things. And when you go out of that circle and start going into other people's audience, it opens up a completely different door for a lot of people. So it's funny because like sometimes I'll be on a podcast that has to do with just the health stuff. I'm a big I was like anti-sugar advocate, right? So like I'll be on a health podcast that focuses on health and the sugar dilemma. And what happens is all of a sudden people are reaching out to me for opportunities in the hardcore health space. But then when I go on a business podcast, they were interested in like the business side of things, and I'll have the inquiries in that world. So it kind of expands your horizons. It just puts you in front of so many different types of people who you just are naturally able to serve depending on what your discussion is. So I think those are like just some of the benefits that happen, and just to be on other people's shows and getting in front of other people's audiences, invaluable.
Yeah, that's a huge benefit. And I like the fact that you said it does kind of train you to speak to different audiences, and it kind of allows you to tap into different skill sets that you have. Like you mentioned there, you have the knowledge of like cutting back on sugar and health benefits, and speaking to that kind of audience that's interested in more of their health. And then you also have the experience and knowledge to talk about the business side of things. So like you really get to sharpen both, I suppose, messages that you convey to these separate audiences.
Yes, definitely.
And I also want to know, like you have mentioned you have like guests on your show. What do you look for when you receive a pitch from someone wanting to be on either the Health Coach Academy or this podcast, Burns Fat?
Yeah, so what I look for is just what value can you bring to the audience, right? So I think that especially, say if we were talking strictly about, this podcast, Burns Fat, for a second, and I just really want to address, the health aspects of things. I love a new topic that we may not have covered. There's so many different avenues of health, and I don't necessarily like to, well, I should say Lori and I don't necessarily want to keep it in one lane when it comes to the many ways to get to a healthy existence. So like when we see a new trend that's popping up and someone can speak on that, we definitely look forward to that, or just even an old trend with a different angle, so we definitely look for that. I think that in as far as Health Coach Academy, because of the way that it's structured, it's really just, what kind of, again, value can you bring to the health coach who's just starting out to take their first steps into actually launching their business. And that's really what we're looking. So we're definitely looking for tips that our audience can benefit from. Like, I think that's why we have the podcast, is to just provide value to the people who are listening. And it's anyone can do that. That's what we're really focusing on putting forward.
Fantastic. Yeah, that makes absolute sense. And I wanted to ask as well, because I previously saw that you mentioned about Chatgpt on the show.
Yeah.
And obviously that's something that everyone's talking about. Everyone is using more or less to one extent or another in their business. But I'd love to know more about how you use this personally, and if there's other tools that you use to like develop your podcast or your business.
Yeah, sure. So I definitely use Chatgpt. I wanted to say before chat, or I should say before I was introduced to chat, I was pretty good at coming up with, titles and stuff like that. And even my show notes as far as the descriptions and stuff of what the episode's about. And then chat proved me wrong. It's like, well, I should say prove me wrong. I know I could do it, but it makes life so much easier. And, and again, like, just if I just say, hey, chat, give me a title about how marketing is beneficial to your business, it'll give me a witty way of saying it that it would have took me a longer time to come up with myself, and probably, or I should say maybe not as good, but just it would have created a lot of time. So I definitely use it for titles when I'm stuck. I try to do the titles on my own initially, but when I'm stuck, forget it, chat's coming in. Oh, he's got to help me out. That's one of those things. And especially like when I'm trying to describe the episode, if I don't come up with something that I feel is compelling, I'll ask chat to say, hey, yeah, this episode's about this. Can you give me a 50-word summary to that effect? And then I'll add in the bio of the person who I'm actually interviewing and such at that point. But yeah, I definitely use it for that. I'm learning a little bit more about the AI technology. I use Pictory, and that's a video generating AI where it's like you can take like say a sales page and upload it to Pictory, and it provides you with like images. It almost creates like what you would think of like at least in the United States, where I am, like a pharmaceutical commercial. It's like it's just like it's very generic backgrounds, and it kind of has relevance to whatever you're talking about in those moments. So it does really well to create videos. I definitely do that. I know my VA, my virtual assistant, she uses Decipher, and that's kind of a way that when you upload your podcast into that system, it timestamps and kind of gives you like the transcriptions of the episodes and some relevant information in that. I'm not as familiar with the dealings with that, but she's the master of it, and that's how she creates show notes and stuff. I think Canva's awesome for putting cover art together and stuff like that, and maybe some postings and stuff for for your social media. So that's kind of the technology stuff that I'm using a lot now. I'm not very good at a lot of the tech stuff, so I do outsource it to my VA and another buddy of mine who's pretty good with doing that stuff. But those are the main things that I'm using right now.
I mean, that's fair enough. It's important to know your strengths and then kind of delegate accordingly. And that brings up another question I'd be curious to know, like, what do you take responsibility of with the show, and then what do you delegate either to your virtual assistant or to your friend?
Yeah, definitely all the preparation, the recording, all that stuff. I definitely do all that. And yeah, just really post-production stuff. I do have an editor as well, so I want to give him a shout out, of course, too. I do send out stuff to him for post-production, and then once it's finished with post-production, it kind of goes to the VA, and then she puts together the show notes and stuff. So I think I do the lion's share of the stuff. I still kind of get the inquiries from people to be on the show, so I do vet them. I do that portion of it and schedule them and whatnot. So I do the lion's share of the front end stuff, but the back end stuff I'm completely useless with. So I definitely got to get rid of that. So I think my strength is definitely being a host and having those conversations and getting the best out of mine, I guess. And that's kind of where I leave it. And all post-production stuff, that tech stuff, I definitely outsource.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I also personally find that post-production is far more tedious.
Yes.
And in the creation process leading up to the episode, it's usually a bit more enjoyable because that's where the ideas come in. That's where you have to really think creatively. And then post-production is really just sticking it all together. And I am just like yourself. I personally prefer the production leading up to it rather than post-production. And I do also have a question that I like to ask all of my guests. Where do you host your podcasts, and why did you pick this platform or platforms?
Oh yeah, I hosted on Libsyn. And are you familiar with Libsyn?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I really like how easy it is. So it's really something that I could just literally, once I record, I use Zoom to record, and I take the audio file, and I basically, after it's sent to the editor and it gets back in the MP3 format, and I just hit, it has like a click box to upload it straight to the platform. I add the art, and then I do the description and the title, and I'm literally done, and Libsyn sends it to all the platforms that you can imagine, right? So it's to a point where I'm so used to it, and it's so easy, I would say that it only takes, if I have everything together, 10 or 15 minutes to do that process itself. And it's always been the easiest for me, and as far as where it goes and its availability, and it's pretty seamless. So I've been using them for a long time. It was a recommendation from Sean at the time, because I think that's what he had used. In my prior experience, I used, and I thought it was a great platform. I don't think if it's around anymore, but it was called Blog Talk Radio. Real cool, but I think they're not around anymore. So the transition to Libsyn was very easy too. So that's definitely the platform I use.
That's cool. Yeah, I always love to ask that because I'm just curious. I'm always really curious to know like why they like it, why they picked it. But that's a good summary. What have been some of the most successful steps that you folks have taken to promote your podcasts?
Yeah, I think for me, it's interesting because I think my attitude has changed to a lot of stuff. I think that it's grown because of the actual market that I'm in, and like, again, using social media, and not through myself personally, but through Lori, who has a big social media presence, is been very, very successful in that respect. So like, if anyone has social media, they should utilize it. I am not that guy who you could look to say that I utilize social media. It's one of my things that I'm still not into, but I'm like I said, I'm a better coach than a player at times. So if I can advise, if you like social media and you want to use it, please definitely use it. I also think that, again, in the networking part of this podcast thing, and especially post-production, when you do get a guest, give them the assets for them to share. Be it even on their newsletter, and like kind of encourage them to do so by making it very easy for them to get it out to their people. So like what I do, I definitely share the show notes. I definitely share like some kind of graphic for them to just say, hey, listen, I was on, this podcast Burns Fad. Here's the show notes, and here's like a little, maybe an audiogram of the episode. Love for you to hear it. And you kind of curate something for them to easily just copy and paste or attach to their newsletter or their social media. And that's been really, really good. And, of course, asking for like ratings and reviews on iTunes and Spotify or whatever place that people actually do listen to, and kind of just ask for that, a little bit of assistance. I found that to be really successful in getting people to get attention onto your podcast. So those are a couple of things that I have utilized over the years.
No, I think that's all good advice. And then as well, on the podcast guesting you do, I can imagine that helps get you in front of new audiences to build the show as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a really good selection of ways to promote your show. And I did want to know, you obviously have mentioned that you do affiliate marketing, perhaps you're maybe earning revenue from the podcast, but how are you first able to monetize it or earn revenue from these podcasts, and how's that progressed?
one of the things that I guess I wish I would focus on more, and I guess that's this thing that I'm trying to accomplish, like that more of a routine, is to take advantage of sponsorship opportunities that do present themselves. And in combination of like the selling of my courses, and then the also like the additional affiliate marketing platforms, I just have to be a little bit more aggressive with it. And that's because I'm not saying like I'm trying to sell things constantly, but anyone who's listening to this, there are ways to kind of just have these things that are available, even via your website. You might have, like, even Sean had it, like anyone who was his guest, he would put his, like say if they were an author, he would just put their book and his Amazon link into his store. He's like, hey, if you like this person's book and you want to buy it, you just, here's the link, and someone will just jump on it. And it's, you're not making bazillions of dollars off that, but it all adds up. And there's just a lot of little ways to progressively increase your income over the time. And that's been my more recent focus, because I think that, again, we all want to continuously do this. I want to do this forever, like, again, and keep growing audiences, but you do have to get paid. You have to put yourself out there and actually get some of your products or other people's products through these affiliate links or sponsorships and such out there. And I think that's kind of where I'm gradually increasing my awareness that I need to do that, where I think I've neglected it in the past. So it's my journey. Yeah. And I'm trying to continually to do that. And also just kind of make myself, when you're a host, sometimes the audience is being pushed to the guest, right? One of the things that I definitely want to start doing too is, like in this podcast right now, you're interviewing me, have more of that in my own personal brand, so that people know I can do it too, kind of thing. Know that I'm not only just helping provide value through another outlet, I have a ton of information that I can dispel on audience as well. So that opens up doors for other opportunities, including like speaking engagements or invitations to just be on other summits, which I do get a lot of now that I didn't get in the beginning because I was kind of hiding behind my guests a little bit. And that's another angle that I guess just has happened in a natural evolution of where I am today as opposed to where I was many years ago. So I know it's a long-winded answer. I hope I touched on a couple of things, but it's still definitely a work in progress to where I definitely want to, like I said, be monetizing it even more to the capacity that it can be monetized.
Yeah, no, I think you've got a lot going on and you made some smart decisions, because I think monetizing or anything that you do for your podcast, it's like spinning plates. You got to keep them going. And the more you got up in the air, the harder it is to keep it going. So it sounds like you've started with a solid collection of like ways of monetizing, and then you're looking to branch out, and you're also very conscious of where to go next. And I completely understand, like, obviously as a business owner as well myself, like I am sometimes concerned of just like bringing guests on and letting them, like, give them the spotlight, in the sense that what you mentioned there, you may not always be able to showcase your knowledge or skills because you are handing the mic over to this guest most of the time. So I think that's very fair of you to say, and I think that's conscious of you in that sense. So I think you're doing some good things.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I honestly never realized it till someone kind of pointed it out to me, because during the affiliate stuff, like, you get a commission back, and it's like, well, this commission is because you showed me to somebody else, and not now that I showed, that particular guest showed their value. And if you're not doing the same thing in the other way, you kind of get lost in it. Like, so I'm trying to think of, say, so for whatever reason, Piers Morgan popped in my head, right? So like, maybe it's because you're acting.
I know, I was going to say, it might be the British thing.
Right, so I was like, okay, so like, would you say hire Piers Morgan to do something for you? I mean, no, he's just the host sometimes, right? Like, he's just, what does, quote unquote, he know? But if Piers stepped back and kind of say, hey, I've interviewed thousands of people on all these different topics, can you imagine what he has to contribute to something, just of absorbing all these knowledge from all these different experts? So that's how, like, I think I'm trying to position myself, I think, going forward a bit as well, because I am an expert now, right? Like I am an expert. I know how to build the podcast. I know how to get traction and revenue through the various ways, and sometimes you kind of neglect that by I'm just the host, and that's kind of all it is, right? So you kind of camouflage yourself in a way. But yeah, that's like there's the next tactical thing that I'm going to do to try to see where that goes.
Yeah, that's fair. You're almost like a curator of knowledge in that sense.
Yeah.
You have all these people coming on, and then you kind of like disseminate what is valuable, and you obviously retain what is valuable, and you're able to share that. So I think that's a fair analogy. And obviously mentioned that you know how to create a podcast. You've created two, what I would consider very successful ones. And I'd love to know, what do you think it takes to create a successful podcast?
Oh, yeah. So I think without a doubt at this point, to create a successful podcast is to basically just answer like what pain points someone actually is going through, and really just giving answers to that. It could go through any genre. Like I said, the pain point for like the Health Coach Academy was like, I have a certificate from some health coach, could be a college, it could be a certification program, and they spent a good amount of money and now they don't know what to do with it, and they're very frustrated about that. How do I get my money back? And or at the minimum, or how do I help people?
Yeah.
And then here is the answers. These are the resources that you need to do so. So that's why I think that was able to work. So for this podcast, Burns Fat, same thing. I'm a person struggling with their weight. They and all the things that go along with that. How do I fix it? And here are the resources for that. So I think that ultimately what it is for someone who wants to start a podcast is to see that, like, what is it that they want to help the world with, right? Or provide knowledge with, or just what experience do you want a person to have? There's wildly successful podcasts about murder mysteries. Like, what are you filling in that void? Like, what are you doing when you have just a comedic podcast? Like, what are you doing, what is that void being filled, right? So I think when you do that, to have a successful podcast, that's what you're really doing, is trying to provide a solution to something and just have it entertaining and open and have like a conversation. Just get into that person in your audience mind. It's like, what do they want to do? And as long as you serve their needs, you have people keep coming back, and then they'll spread the word as well.
That's awesome. I did want to ask before we go, what advice do you have? I think you really hit the nail on the head there with like, try and solve their pain points, like look to solve their pain points. But is there anything else that you wanted to share with our audience before we go?
I think the key is to be ready to maybe not be heard initially, right? You put something out there, and sometimes the statistics, they always talk about like the statistics, you should anything you can count, you can improve upon and measure and all that kind of stuff. But there's always going to be like this little point where you just putting things out there and maybe nobody's listening, right? And it's very easy for a person to stop right there. And that's not how it works in the podcasting world. And it's funny because like my earlier episodes are being listened to now way more than they were in the beginning, because it's almost like when you're watching a Netflix show, sometimes you don't want to commit to a show that only has one season, because it's like, well, am I going to commit to this show for one season and be left and it's going to be a cliffhanger and I want more? It's just like, you kind of want to see some staying power for some of these things. And I think that's with podcasting as well. And there's one of these things that podcasts, in essence, so that they're in the internet somewhere all over time. So they'll be stumbling upon that at some point. So I think that perspective helps people kind of push through it. And I think that is one of the things that grows over time. So I think that's one of the things, if someone wants a podcast, to try to get guidance too. I mean, that's one of the things we spoke about a little bit earlier. Mentorship is important. Just being amongst people who have done it already and they can pick their brain about it. I think that's very important as well.
Yeah, I think that's some really sage advice, especially for any content creators. I think that it's applicable to podcasters and aspiring podcasters, but as well, anyone that's out there doing YouTube or blogging or putting anything out. It takes a really long time, it seems, before you get heard and you get recognized. It's just that consistency of just being willing to put stuff out there, even if it's not immediately getting picked up. I think that's really good advice to finish on.
Oh, no, thank you. Appreciate that.
Fantastic. So Health Coach Academy and this podcast, Burn Fat, I'd highly recommend anyone that's listening to go check them out and leave reviews. But Omar, if they are interested in reaching out to you or just keeping up with you in general, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate again being on the show. It's great to be on the other side of the microphone. So, yeah, OmarCumberbatch.com is where you can find everything that I'm up to, my social media handles, my course that I put out about just monetizing podcasts and helping grow businesses in relation to podcasting, and it helps supplement whatever you're doing at this point. So that's something on my website that I'd love for anyone who wants to, or it's considering starting a podcast, definitely is worth taking a peek out. It's definitely focused on health coaches, but I've been getting a lot of people in the coaching world who are jumping on it, and they really appreciate just the guidance, the step-by-step to go through that process. It's a standalone course that I do assist on the end when the questions come up that need for launching and stuff like that. So OmarCumberbatch.com is where you can find most of the stuff that I do, and I look forward to hearing from your audience, and is really excited to be on your show.
Thanks, Omar. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today. Remember, you can find more helpful resources to grow your business with podcasting on our blog at podwritten.com and on Instagram at podwritten. You can also find a full transcript for this episode on our website, so be sure to visit podwritten.com or follow the links in the episode description. Until next time, stay healthy, happy, and successful.